Welcome back. Get comfortable. Pull that blanket a little closer, adjust your pillow just right, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we are spending our time together inside one of the most strange, layered, brilliant, and quietly emotional shows ever made for adult animation. We are going to move through 153 facts about Rick and Morty, the creation, the characters, the science, the secrets hiding in plain sight, the moments behind the microphone you would never guess just from watching. And we are going to do it slowly, softly, the way a good story deserves to be told. There is no rush here. Every fact will land gently, settle in, and breathe. Some of these will surprise you. Some will make something click that you noticed, but never quite understood. A few might even make you feel something warm, in the way that very few animated shows ever manage to do. So close your eyes if you want, let the words wash over you, and let us begin at the very beginning, which like all the best beginnings, starts with a bored, creative person and a ridiculous parody. Part 1. Where it all came from. The origin story. The story of Rick and Morty does not begin with a writer's room, a pitch meeting, or a carefully developed concept. It begins with a crude, deliberately offensive, and deeply strange animated short created by a man named Justin Roiland for a short film festival in Los Angeles. Fact 1. The entire show traces its origin back to a short film called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, which Roiland created in 2006 for Channel 101, a nonprofit monthly short film festival co-founded by Dan Harmon. Channel 101 worked on a simple and rather wonderful premise. Creators submitted short films in the format of television pilots, and a live audience voted on which ones would continue as an ongoing series. It was as democratic and unpredictable as storytelling can get. Fact 2. The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty was, in Roiland's own words, a vulgar, deliberately terrible parody of Doc Brown and Marty McFly from the Back to the Future film trilogy. The short was made as a sort of creative provocation, and it was loaded with offensive content almost as an experiment in how far someone could push an audience. The characters were crude parodies, the animation was rough, and the humor was deeply transgressive. It was not meant to become the seed of one of the most beloved animated shows of the 21st century. And yet. Fact 3. Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland first crossed paths at Channel 101. Roiland had been submitting content to the festival since 2004, about a year after it launched. His early submissions were, by his own account, driven largely by shock value, what he called sick and twisted elements, and the audience reactions were generally confused rather than enthusiastic. But something about his sensibility caught Harmon's attention, and the two began to build a working friendship from those early, chaotic festival nights. Fact 4. When Adult Swim approached Dan Harmon in 2012 about developing a new animated series for the network, Harmon had just been, in a turn of events that shaped the entire trajectory of adult animation, briefly fired from Community, the NBC sitcom he created. He was, at that moment, sitting in his unfurnished office on the Paramount Pictures lot, the kind of in-between space where creative people tend to make some of their best decisions. Adult Swim, which was looking for something that could become a real primetime hit, reached out to Harmon. He was initially skeptical. He was not particularly familiar with animation as a medium, and his approach to television had always been intensely focused on character, dialogue, and story structure. He considered himself a live-action writer at heart, but he made a phone call. Fact 5. Harmon called Roiland and asked if he had any ideas for an animated series. Roiland almost immediately suggested using the Doc and Marty characters. He did not pause to think about it or propose anything else. He just said, those two. Renamed, reworked, built into something with more depth, but those two at the center of it. Harmon agreed. And in the hours that followed, they wrote the first draft of what would become the Rick and Morty pilot. Fact 6. That first draft was completed in 6 hours. 6 hours in that same unfurnished Community office on the Paramount lot, the two of them working fast and feeding off each other's energy. The pilot that emerged from those 6 hours was rough around the edges but contained the essential genetic material of everything the show would eventually become. The relationship between the brilliant, dismissive old scientist and the nervous, good-hearted grandson was there. The dangerous adventures were there. The love underneath the dysfunction was there, even then. Fact 7. Before the show found its home at Adult Swim, Justin Roiland had already pitched 3 different animated show pilots to Fox, none of which had gotten off the ground. By the time he brought Rick and Morty to Adult Swim, he had begun to feel genuinely burned out on the process of developing television. He was skeptical of notes, resistant to outside input, and wary of the whole machinery of network development. Dan Harmon, who understood that wariness deeply after his own complicated experiences at NBC, was exactly the right creative partner to help him navigate it. Fact 8. Adult Swim initially pushed back on one aspect of the pilot. They were not sure Roiland should be doing both voices. The character of Morty was, in the early draft, far less developed as a person. He was more of a punching bag than a partner, someone who absorbed the abuse Rick threw at him without much interiority of his own. The head of Adult Swim was not fond of that early version of Morty and did not think Roiland's approach to the character was working. This could have changed everything. It almost ended Roiland's vocal involvement with his own show. Fact 9. To save Roiland's role as Morty, Dan Harmon wrote 4 short prose premises in which Morty took a more assertive and emotionally active role. Scenes where Morty pushed back, where Morty had a perspective worth listening to, where Morty was a real participant in the story, rather than just a victim of it. Harmon sent these to Adult Swim's Mike Lazo, who had what he described as a premonition about it. He gave the green light. Roiland kept both roles. And the version of Morty who could stand up to Rick, challenge him, and love him in equal measure was born. Fact 10. Originally, Justin Roiland wanted the show to run in 11-minute segments. He imagined it as a shorter-form series, closer to what he had been making for Channel 101. Adult Swim pushed hard for a half-hour format. The network's reasoning was practical. They needed content that could fill a proper broadcast slot and compete in the way that longer shows can. Roiland was initially reluctant, but the decision to expand the format turned out to be transformative. The half-hour runtime gave the show room for the domestic scenes that ground the science fiction, for the relationship moments that give the chaos meaning, and for the kind of emotional depth that shorter episodes simply could not have sustained. Fact 11. The idea to make Rick specifically Morty's grandfather, rather than a neighbor or a friend or any other kind of figure, came from Adult Swim development executive Nick Weidenfeld. Harmon felt that building a family around the characters was essential to extending what could have been a very thin premise into a full show. Weidenfeld's suggestion that the relationship be specifically between a grandfather and his grandchild introduced a particular dynamic that turned out to be the show's emotional spine. A father and son have a kind of expected conflict built into their relationship. A grandfather and grandson have something different, a space of unusual tenderness, unusual honesty, unusual freedom. Rick can be who he is with Morty in a way he cannot be with anyone else, and part of that is because the relationship exists at one remove from the pressure cooker of parenthood. Fact 12. The show premiered on Adult Swim on December 2nd, 2013. 11 years before that premiere, Justin Roiland had moved to Houston, Texas, and then to Los Angeles. He was working as a producer on reality programming when he first discovered Channel 101. The distance between those beginnings and the premiere of Rick and Morty is a reminder of how long and winding the road to a great piece of work usually is. Fact 13. The theme song that plays over the opening credits of Rick and Morty was not composed specifically for the show. It was originally written by Ryan Elder for a rejected Cartoon Network pilot that Roiland had made called Dog World. The pilot was never picked up, but the theme survived. A later episode, Lawnmower Dog, even quietly acknowledged this by referencing the show's title within the episode itself, a tiny piece of self-aware continuity that rewards careful listeners. Fact 14. In the show's initial pitch to Adult Swim, Rick was written to be significantly more unpleasant than the version audiences eventually fell in love with. He was more of a straight villain, someone who genuinely endangered Morty without ambivalence, without the thread of buried care that makes the character so compelling to watch. As the writing developed, the relationship between Rick's surface behavior and his hidden emotional life became increasingly central to what the show was actually about. The cruelty became a shell. And what made the shell interesting was everything underneath it. Fact 15. Dan Harmon has described his approach to Rick and Morty's core concept as a cross between Matt Groening's two landmark shows, The Simpsons and Futurama. The Simpsons gave them the domestic family framework, the way that a dysfunctional household can become the emotional anchor for stories that go in almost any direction. Futurama gave them the science fiction permission, the sense that you could embed genuinely speculative ideas inside a comedic structure and have both elements work simultaneously. Rick and Morty inherited the best instincts of both, then went places neither had gone. Part 2. The voices in the booth. Everything about performance. Every animated show lives and dies on the quality of its voice performances, and Rick and Morty was fortunate from the beginning to have voices that felt completely unlike anything else on television. The story of how those voices came to exist and how they were preserved after the most dramatic cast change in adult animation history is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent television. Fact 16. Justin Roiland did not develop Rick's distinctive burping vocal style in a planned or deliberate way. He was doing what he described as really crappy impressions of Doc Brown from Back to the Future, simply goofing around when a burp came out naturally in the middle of a line. He found it funny, decided to see if he could do it again, and it became a cornerstone of Rick's identity. As he told Entertainment Weekly, the burping was just part of Rick from the very beginning of the recording sessions. It was not a choice so much as a discovery. Fact 17. To produce the burps during recording sessions, Justin Roiland reportedly drank water and beer. This was not a precise science. It was an informal, slightly chaotic process of keeping the digestive machinery ready to produce the sounds at the right moments in a line of dialogue. The burp-talking style became so central to Rick's voice that it became almost impossible to imagine the character without it. And when the show was eventually recast, it was one of the most difficult elements for the new actors to replicate authentically. Fact 18. Dan Harmon has admitted that he occasionally arranged for Justin Roiland to record his dialogue while actually genuinely under the influence of alcohol. This was not a constant practice, but it was not entirely rare either. The reasoning was that Roiland's delivery for Rick, the loose, spontaneous quality of it, the sense that the character was genuinely slightly unmoored, was helped by actual intoxication in a way that was difficult to fully simulate. Rick Sanchez is perpetually drinking from his flask, and something about Roiland performing with real alcohol in his system matched that energy in ways that remained visible on screen. Fact 19. One of the most remarkable things about Justin Roiland's performance for the first 6 seasons of the show is that he was doing both voices simultaneously, Rick and Morty, often within the same conversations, in the same recording sessions. The back and forth between grandfather and grandson, which sounds so much like two distinct people genuinely interacting, was largely produced by a single person in a booth, jumping between characters, sometimes mid-sentence. The dynamic felt live even when it was constructed. That felt live quality became the standard against which everything that came after was measured. Fact 20. Rick's famous catchphrase, "Wubba Luba Dub Dub," was not written into the script as a planned addition. It came from a moment of improvisation during recording. The script originally called for Rick to channel Curly from the Three Stooges, running in a circle on the ground, while making the whoop 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 sound. Roiland, who by his own admission tends to skip over most stage directions and just speak what feels right, blurted out a different sound entirely. Everyone in the room thought it was funnier than what had been written. It stayed. It became one of the most recognizable phrases in animated television. And according to the show itself, the phrase translates from Bird Person's language as, "I am in great pain, please help me," which retroactively gives the silly catchphrase a depth of sadness that fits the character almost too perfectly. Fact 21. Dan Harmon voices more characters on Rick and Morty than most viewers realize. He has portrayed at least 23 named characters across the series, including some of the show's most memorable recurring figures. His most significant voice role is Bird Person, Rick's deeply loyal and philosophical old friend, whose arc across the series is one of the most emotionally affecting storylines the show has ever produced. Harmon has also voiced Ice-T, not the actual rapper Ice-T, but a fictional alien version named Ice-T who, in one of the show's most quietly delightful reveals, turns out to be a literal block of ice from the planet Alphabetrium, who was exiled to Earth. He also voices Davin, an early character who appears in the very first episode and is killed by a jealous Jerry in a subsequent one, which says everything you need to know about Jerry's relationship with men who are better looking than he is. Fact 22. Chris Parnell, who plays Jerry Smith, was still working on Saturday Night Live when Rick and Morty was first being cast. Bryan Cranston, yes, that Bryan Cranston in the middle of his run on Breaking Bad, actually auditioned for the role of Jerry in the show's early production period. The idea of the voice of Walter White playing the mild, self-defeating Jerry Smith is one of those alternate universe casting scenarios that is fascinating, precisely because it is so wrong. Cranston lost the role to Parnell, and the show is better for it. Fact 23. Spencer Grammer, who provides the voice of Summer Smith, is the daughter of Kelsey Grammer, best known for playing Frasier Crane across decades of television. The casting brings a kind of accidental elegance to the family dynamics of the show. There is a dynasty of voice performance running through the Grammer family, even if Rick and Morty plays it in an entirely different register than anything Frasier ever occupied. Fact 24. Sarah Chalk, who plays Beth Smith, is actually fluent in French. The show used this in a wonderfully specific way in the Season 6 episode Bethic Twinstinct, in which the two versions of Beth, the Earth Beth and the Space Beth who has been living with Rick across the multiverse, speak to each other in Venusian. The Venusian language in the show's cosmology just happens to sound exactly like French. Because Sarah Chalk was available and genuinely able to speak the language, the scene was performed in actual French, which adds a layer of linguistic grounding to one of the show's more surreal conceits. Fact 25. When Justin Roiland was fired from the show in January 2023, following domestic abuse charges that were later dropped due to insufficient evidence, Adult Swim had to find new voices for Rick and Morty, roles that had been associated with one actor for an entire decade of broadcasting. The producers and showrunners described the search as one of the most difficult casting processes any of them had ever experienced. They needed soundalikes who could be virtually indistinguishable from the original performances, and they needed actors who could sustain that likeness not just in isolated moments, but across entire episodes, entire seasons, entire story arcs. Fact 26. The search for new voices lasted approximately 6 months. According to producer Scott Martyr, they heard thousands of submissions. The problem with finding a new Rick, specifically, was that almost everyone who tried tended to fall into one of two failure modes. They either sounded like the rough impression Roiland's voice had always invited, something close to Macho Man Randy Savage, broad and gravelly in the wrong ways, or they sounded like a distant cousin of the character rather than the character himself. Pure moments of Rick were there in various candidates, but sustaining that for a full episode was a different challenge entirely. Fact 27. Ian Cardoni, who was ultimately cast as the new voice of Rick, was actually one of the first candidates identified during the search. He emerged in what the producers called the first wave, and the response to his early recordings was that he had major flashes of the character, moments where he sounded genuinely indistinguishable from Roiland's Rick. The challenge was testing whether those flashes could hold. He was brought back repeatedly, put through material he would not normally encounter in a standard audition, and asked to sustain the voice across scenes of different emotional registers. He passed every test. Fact 28. Harry Belden, the new voice of Morty, was found significantly later in the process than Cardoni. While Rick proved to be the more technically difficult voice to replace, Morty's emotional range was the harder thing to capture. The mix of nervousness, genuine bravery, adolescent embarrassment, and deep love for a grandfather who was often terrible to him. Belden was brought through the same rigorous process, and by the time both actors had been selected, the casting team felt they had found something genuinely close to what had existed before. Fact 29. One of the most surprising things that the new voice actors, Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden, revealed about their recording process is that they do not record together. In fact, they are recorded in entirely separate locations. Most listeners assume that the fluid back-and-forth energy between Rick and Morty in any given scene comes from two actors bouncing off each other in real time in the same room. It does not. The conversations are constructed in post-production from separately recorded performances, which means that the sense of real dialogue, the interruptions, the overlaps, the rhythm of two people genuinely talking, is manufactured through editing and performance instinct rather than live interaction. Fact 30. John Allen took over the role of Mr. Poopy Butthole from Roiland, starting with Season 7, making him one of the more visible recastings outside the two leads. Mr. Poopy Butthole, despite his absurd name, is actually one of the show's most emotionally important characters. A small, cheerful, relentlessly positive figure who functions as a counterargument to the show's nihilistic tendencies. Allen's performance has maintained by the warmth and directness that made the character work in the first place, which is more technically demanding than it might appear. Because keeping a character that optimistic from tipping into saccharine or annoying requires a delicate lightness of touch. Before we move deeper into the show's creative machinery, there are a few more performance-level facts worth sitting with because the voices of Rick and Morty are so central to what the show is that no survey of the show's history can treat them as settled, simply because the basic facts are in place. Fact 30A. The voices of Rick and Morty are not recorded in isolation from the writing. In the Roiland era, a significant portion of each episode's most memorable lines arrived through improvisation, moments where Roiland, in the booth with the script in front of him, deviated from what was written and produced something that ended up in the final cut. This was not a practice encouraged for other voice actors on the show to the same degree, but for the two lead roles, the improvisational energy was treated as a feature rather than a risk. The specific stammers, the mid-sentence changes of direction, the moments where Rick seems to be genuinely working something out in real time as he speaks, many of these were not planned. Fact 30B. The challenge that Ian Cardoni faced in taking over as Rick was not simply phonetic. It was not just about matching the frequency and timbre of a voice. It was about capturing a specific cognitive style expressed through voice. The sense that Rick is always processing at a speed slightly higher than anyone around him, that he is already at the end of the argument while everyone else is still finding their beginning. A voice can be matched. A thinking rhythm is harder. The work Cardoni did to internalize not just the sound of Rick, but the intellectual pace of Rick is, by all available accounts, extraordinary in ways that do not always get named in the conversation about the show's transition. Fact 30C. Sarah Chalk, who has played Beth Smith from the very first episode, has noted in interviews that the character's emotional range has expanded significantly across the show's run. Beth in the early seasons is primarily reactive. She responds to Rick's presence, to Jerry's inadequacy, to her children's needs. Beth in the later seasons has become an initiating force in storylines, making choices that drive narratives rather than simply being driven by them. Chalk has been careful about how she manages that evolution. The voice that was right for an earlier Beth had to grow into something more capable of carrying the weight the writers began placing on the character, and her ability to make that growth feel continuous rather than jarring is one of the show's less discussed performance achievements. Part 3. How the stories get built, writing, structure, and process. Rick and Morty has one of the most distinctive storytelling sensibilities in television, and that sensibility comes from a very specific set of tools and philosophies that its creators have used consciously and deliberately across the show's entire run. Understanding how the show is written tells you a great deal about why it hits the way it does. Fact 31. Dan Harmon's foundational storytelling tool is something he calls the story circle, an 8-step narrative structure that he developed and has used across Community, Rick and Morty, and virtually everything else he has ever created. The story circle is itself based on Joseph Campbell's monomyth, sometimes called the hero's journey, but Harmon adapted and compressed it into a more practical working tool for episodic television. The 8 steps are you, need, go, search, find, take, return, and change. Every protagonist in every episode moves through some version of those 8 stages, and the engine of the story is always the gap between who the character is at the beginning and who they have become by the end. Fact 32. The show made its own storytelling process literal in the season 4 episode Never Ricking Morty, which features a physical story train, a literal circular vehicle that generates and contains stories. The story train is divided into 8 sections corresponding to the 8 stages of Harmon's story circle. It is one of the most beautifully self-aware things the show has ever done, using the structure of the episode itself to describe the structure of every episode. The fake advertisement for the story train at the end of the episode even calls it an anthology generator, which is exactly what Harmon's story circles are. Fact 33. The writer's room for Rick and Morty was, particularly in the early seasons, notably smaller than most major animated shows. The first season was written by a core group of just 6 people: Roiland, Harmon, Tom Kaufman, Ryan Ridley, Wade Randolph, and Eric Acosta. Writing assistant Mike McMahon was also given writing credit. This small, intensely collaborative group worked with what Harmon described as a lot of heavy lifting from everybody. The tightness of the team contributed to the tight thematic consistency of those first episodes. When fewer people are in a room, a single strong vision can hold the entire thing together more naturally. Fact 34. The writing staff went through a significant shift in Season 3 when the writer's room became, for the first time in the show's history, gender-balanced. The arrival of female writers changed the creative dynamic in ways that both Harmon and Roiland acknowledged publicly. According to various accounts, the female writers contributed substantially to the richer development of Beth and Summer's storylines. Characters who, in the early seasons, had often been defined more by their relationships to Rick, Jerry, and Morty than by their own interior lives. Season 3's more ambitious approach to both characters is widely credited to this change. Fact 35. Dan Harmon has admitted openly that his perfectionism was the primary reason Season 3 was shortened from the originally planned 14 episodes to just 10. The delays that characterized the gap between Seasons 2 and 3, a gap of nearly 2 full years, were, by his own account, a product of his own standards rather than external obstacles. He simply could not let episodes leave the writer's room until they were exactly right. And exactly right took longer than anyone had anticipated. The same perfectionism that produces the show's remarkable narrative density is also the thing that makes the waits between seasons so long. Fact 36. The writer's room at Rick and Morty's production studio bore a striking physical resemblance to the writer's room from Community. Harmon noted this himself, and the comparison extended beyond the physical space. The culture of the room was similarly intense, argumentative, and emotionally invested. The key difference, according to Harmon, was that the Rick and Morty room was smaller and what he called more rough and tumble verbally. Arguments were not just permitted, but expected. The energy of those disagreements fed directly into the energy of the show. Fact 37. Dan Harmon has described Rick Sanchez, at a philosophical level, as a self-interested anarchist who has been driven toward mental illness by the weight of his own intelligence and his awareness of the universe's indifference. Harmon's perspective is that Rick's knowledge, the certainty that nothing fundamentally matters in a vast and cold cosmos, is accurate but gets you nowhere useful. What the show is actually about, beneath the science fiction and the comedy, is the question of how to live meaningfully in a universe that does not provide meaning from the outside. Rick has the most complete picture of that universe of anyone in the show, and the most broken response to it. Fact 38. The show has a deliberately large and sprawling backstory for Rick that Harmon and Roiland developed in detail but have been intentionally slow to reveal. Their reasoning is a philosophy about audience investment. Once a show begins to systematically explain a character's backstory, fans start to feel that the show is running out of new things to say. Keeping Rick's past partially obscured, offering fragments, hints, and implications rather than clean explanations, creates a permanent sense that there is more to the character than what has been seen. It is a form of restraint that requires considerable discipline and has paid off in the ongoing emotional richness of the series. Fact 39. One of the show's most philosophically interesting recurring details is a box in Rick's garage labeled time travel stuff that sits perpetually on a shelf. This box is, according to the creators, a deliberate in-universe joke about how they feel about time travel as a storytelling device. Harmon and Roiland have both expressed discomfort with time travel plots. They feel that time travel tends to collapse a story's stakes, because if you can undo any consequence, then nothing matters. The labeled box is their way of acknowledging the device's existence in the show's world, while visually communicating that they have no intention of using it as a crutch. It stays on the shelf. It has stayed there for years. Every time the camera catches it, it is a small, private joke between the writers and the audience. Fact 40. Rick Sanchez has only been explicitly identified as autistic in one episode, the Season 3 finale, The Rick and Morty Date, where it is stated casually and without much fanfare. The show does not make this a major plot point or revisit it extensively, which is consistent with its approach to Rick's interiority in general. Information about who Rick actually is tends to arrive as a fragment, a passing detail, rather than as a declared theme. But the reveal retroactively explains a great deal about Rick's social patterns, his difficulty with eye contact in certain scenes, his insistence on maintaining particular routines, and his complex relationship with systems of meaning that other people navigate more instinctively. Fact 41. Dan Harmon has spoken at length about why Rick drinks, or more accurately about why Rick does not simply engineer a way to be perpetually at the right level of intoxication without actually drinking. His thinking is that Rick, who could certainly design a nanobiotic alcohol dispenser or inject himself with something that kept his blood alcohol level exactly where he wanted it, chooses not to do so because he is afraid of losing sight of who he is. The physical act of drinking, the ritual of it, the choice to pick up the flask, the way it marks time, is the thing that keeps Rick tethered to something human. Without the act, he fears, he would drift further from the last remaining remnants of himself. Fact 42. The relationship between Rick and Morty is, in the writer's conception, built on a very specific technical detail. Morty's brainwaves cancel out Rick's own in a way that makes Rick undetectable by most alien surveillance and tracking systems. This is the practical in-universe reason why Rick chose Morty as his adventure partner rather than Summer or anyone else. But the emotional truth that the show has developed around this practical fact is something far more interesting. Rick chose Morty because he needed someone, and the universe gave him a grandchild whose entire nervous system made them naturally, biologically attuned to each other in ways neither of them fully understands. Fact 43. The question of whether the Beth we see throughout most of the show is the real Beth or the clone that Rick may or may not have created, the Beth who stayed behind while Space Beth went out into the universe, was deliberately left unresolved by the writers. According to the show's own mythology, Rick arranged things so that even he cannot know which Beth is which. But the reason this ambiguity exists is practical as well as poetic. The writers themselves did not decide which Beth was the original. They consciously chose not to answer the question in the writer's room, keeping both options equally alive in the narrative. This means that every scene involving Beth can be read in two ways simultaneously, and the show intends both readings to be valid. Fact 44. The show's use of post-credit scenes and end-of-episode tags has been one of its most consistent and rewarding devices. From the very first episode, the show trained its audience to stay through the credits, because what comes after them is often as emotionally or narratively significant as what came before. The post-credit sequences have ranged from broad comedy to genuinely moving character work, to world-building that recontextualizes the main episode in retrospect. The practice rewards patient viewers and creates a feeling of bonus content that deepens the experience without overextending it. Fact 45. Dan Harmon's story circle, when applied to individual characters within a single episode, produces something that Harmon has described as a nested structure. Multiple circles running simultaneously within the same episode, each tracking a different character's journey through the same 8 stages. This is why Rick and Morty episodes tend to feel so dense and complete, even when they are moving fast and covering enormous tonal ground. Every major character in a well-constructed episode is moving through their own circle at the same time, and the intersections between those individual arcs produce the show's characteristic sense that everything is happening at once for reasons that are all, somehow, connected. Part 4. Pencils, Pixels, and Color. The animation behind the show. The visual identity of Rick and Morty is one of the most deliberately constructed and consistently maintained in modern animation, built on a set of specific design choices that are more thoughtful than they might initially appear. Fact 46. The show's animation is produced using Toon Boom Harmony, the industry standard software for professional animation. Background art is created in Adobe Photoshop, and post-production work is handled in Adobe After Effects. This is a more streamlined and software-dependent approach than many older animated shows, and it allows the team to maintain a high level of visual consistency across productions that happen in different countries. Fact 47. For the first 8 seasons, animation production was handled by Bardell Entertainment, a mob entertainment in Vancouver, Canada. Starting with Season 9, Mercury Filmworks in Ottawa, Canada took over that role. Lighthouse Studios in Kilkenny, Ireland has been involved since Season 7. The fact that a show so American in its cultural DNA is actually animated in Canada and Ireland is one of those production details that rarely makes it into public discussions about the show. But it speaks to how deeply globalized the animation industry has become. Fact 48. The character designs on Rick and Morty were developed with a specific philosophy. The characters are deliberately drawn with odd or asymmetrical features to prevent them from looking too normal to live in the Rick and Morty universe. Season 3 art director Jeffrey Thompson explained this principle directly. In a world defined by chaos, visual perfection would feel false. The subtle wrongnesses in how each character looks contribute to a feeling that they belong to the world they inhabit. A world where nothing is quite aligned and nothing is quite what it seems. Fact 49. Justin Roiland's overall cartooning style is explicitly and consciously indebted to The Simpsons. He acknowledged this directly in a 2013 interview, pointing out that the mouth shapes he uses, the teeth, and the general character proportions all carry the influence of Matt Groening's design language. He also drew comparisons to Pendleton Ward's style on Adventure Time and J.G. Quintel's style on Regular Show, noting that all of them were roughly the same age, all were influenced by The Simpsons growing up, and all had absorbed similar visual vocabularies from that shared point of origin. Fact 50. John Kricfalusi's The Ren and Stimpy Show was another significant visual influence, and it shows in a specific detail: the small W-shaped mouths that Rick and Morty characters occasionally make. Roiland has confirmed that these mouths are a direct reference to an expression that Ren frequently made in that show. Ren and Stimpy was formative for an entire generation of animators in ways that still show up in the visual language of American adult animation, and Rick and Morty is one of its clearest inheritors. Fact 51. In any given episode where Rick and Morty travel between dimensions or encounter multiple realities, there is a recurring pink and blue alien creature that appears somewhere in the background. It has become one of the show's most quietly beloved visual running gags, and attentive viewers have made it something of a sport to find it in each episode. The creature is easy to miss when you are following the main action, and finding it rewards the kind of obsessive second-viewing attention that Rick and Morty encourages more explicitly than almost any other animated show. Fact 52. Mr. Meeseeks was originally designed to be neon brown in color. This was the production team's first instinct for the character, and the plan was apparently set enough that it reached test audiences. Those test audiences had a negative reaction to the brown Meeseeks. Something about the color seemed off in a way that undermined the character's specific visual identity. The producers changed the design to the bright, familiar light blue that we now associate with Mr. Meeseeks, and the rest is history. It is difficult to imagine a brown Meeseeks having become the cultural icon that the blue one has become. Color is not a small thing in animation. Fact 53. The pilot episode of Rick and Morty contains a shot in the interdimensional customs zone that functions as a Where's Waldo for science fiction fans. In the background of this scene, visible as alien silhouettes, are figures from various science fiction franchises. Among those that have been identified by sharp-eyed viewers, the prawn creatures from District 9, the xenomorph from the Alien franchise, and the Mooninites from Aqua Teen Hunger Force. The shot is dense enough that identifying all of the cameos is genuinely difficult, and fans have spent years cataloging them. Fact 54. Rick's portal gun, the portal gun, which might be the single most important prop in the show's entire universe, produces a specific shade of green light that has become one of the show's most recognizable visual signatures. That green is consistent across every dimension portal in every season, maintaining a visual continuity even as the worlds on the other side of those portals become increasingly varied and strange. The color functions like a brand. Every time that green glow appears on screen, the audience knows something interdimensional is about to happen. Fact 55. In Rick's bedroom, which is seen briefly in a post-credits scene from the first season episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, viewers who paused the screen discovered that Rick has a wall covered in photographs, documents, and connecting threads, a conspiracy board of sorts. The images on the wall include characters from past episodes, as well as figures that had not yet appeared in the show at the time of broadcast. Among them was a picture of Aberdolf Linkler, a character who would appear in the very next episode. Rick in his private space is apparently doing exactly what the show's most devoted fans are doing, tracking every encounter, every threat, every loose end, building a map of a universe that keeps expanding in every direction. Fact 56. The garage floor of the Smith house, which functions as the entrance to Rick's lab and the staging area for most of the show's departures, contains a large crack across it that dates from the first season finale, when the house was teleported to another planet. Careful viewers watching subsequent episodes can see this crack still present in the floor of the garage, a small but consistent piece of architectural continuity that rewards viewers who pay attention. The production team did not have to include it. It would have been easy to simply reset the floor to pristine condition, but keeping the damage speaks to the show's broader commitment to the idea that events have lasting consequences. Fact 57. The establishing shot of the Smith house's exterior has been reproduced consistently enough across the series that fans have studied it in detail. The house is located in a suburb outside of Seattle, Washington, a detail the show established early and has maintained. The Pacific Northwest setting, with its characteristic gray skies and low green hedges, gives the domestic scenes a specific visual temperature that contrasts effectively with the vivid, saturated colors of the alien environments. The Earth scenes feel cool and overcast. Everything else feels brighter and more dangerous. Fact 58. Dan Harmon's production company, Harmonious Claptrap, whose vanity card appears at the end of each episode, has been a quiet and unexpectedly emotional running detail in the show's history. In the early seasons, the card showed a happy domestic image of Harmon, with his then-wife Erin McGathy and their pets sitting comfortably together. After Harmon's divorce in 2015, the card changed. Season 3's version showed Harmon alone on a couch, surrounded by his pets and empty bottles of liquor, and what can only be described as the visual vocabulary of someone who is not doing particularly well. It is one of the strangest and most unexpectedly intimate pieces of production detail in all of adult animation, a creator's personal circumstances bleeding quietly and unmistakably into the public record of his own show. Fact 59. The show's distinctive visual rhythm, the way it cuts, the pacing of its action sequences, the particular speed at which jokes land and then move on, comes significantly from the work of its directors, who, according to Dan Harmon, are responsible for every frame of the show's visuals. Harmon has said directly that the directors are the ones who live and die by the show's visual quality, and that the writing team trusts them completely with translating the scripts into animation. The collaborative relationship between the writing room and the directing team is less hierarchical than on many productions, which contributes to the creative density of individual episodes. Fact 60. In the Season 3 episode Morty's Mind Blowers, which follows Rick and Morty as they revisit erased memories stored in vials in a secret drawer, one of the background details visible in the storage room is the scale of what has been removed. There are hundreds of vials. The quantity is staggering, and the implications of it, that Morty has been through so much traumatic material that a dedicated room is required to contain what he has chosen to forget, hit differently when you stop and let the visual register. It is one of those moments where the background is doing more narrative work than the foreground. A few additional production details are worth lingering on here because they speak to the level of care invested in making the show look exactly the way the creators want it to look. Fact 60A. The alien worlds and environments depicted across the show are each developed with distinct visual vocabularies, color palettes, architectural styles, lighting temperatures, and design sensibilities that communicate something about the civilizations inhabiting them before any dialogue arrives. The production design team works from extensive visual bibles for each new world, ensuring that the backgrounds and architecture tell a story consistent with what the scripts describe. This is work that viewers rarely consciously notice, but it is work that they feel in the way that a well-designed room feels different from a randomly assembled one, even when you cannot articulate why. Fact 60b. One of the recurring small jokes in the show's background design is the use of recognizable but slightly wrong versions of Earth consumer products and corporate branding in alien or interdimensional contexts. Fast food chains, technology companies, and pharmaceutical brands appear in the backgrounds of other dimensions in modified forms. Same general shape and color, different name, implying a kind of pan-dimensional corporate ubiquity that says something quietly dark about the relationship between capitalism and the multiverse. The specific modifications to each brand name are often funny in their own right, functioning as visual jokes that reward pausing and reading. Fact 60c. The character animation on Rick and Morty, specifically the way Rick moves and holds his body, was developed with a deliberate physicality that communicates his relationship to the space he occupies. Rick moves through environments as if he owns them, or more precisely, as if ownership is a concept too small to apply to him. His posture is loose and slightly contemptuous, his gestures large and economical at the same time. Every physical choice in his animation reinforces the sense that he is operating at a different speed from everyone around him, that he is already 3 moves ahead and finds the current moment slightly beneath his attention. This is animation doing character work that writing alone cannot fully accomplish. Part 5. What You Missed: The Easter Eggs and Hidden Connections. Part of what makes Rick and Morty one of the most rewatchable shows in animation is its extraordinary density of background detail, foreshadowing, and hidden connections between episodes. These are not accidental. They are carefully placed rewards for attentive, returning viewers. Fact 61. One of the most widely praised pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series concerns the origin of the memory parasites in the Season 2 episode Total Recall. These parasites implant false memories into the Smith family, and the episode derives much of its tension from the family's attempt to identify which of their memories and which of the people in their lives are real. What many viewers missed on first viewing is that the parasites are actually foreshadowed in the previous episode, Morty Night Run. In that episode's closing moments, Rick is loading green geodes into his spaceship. Visible on those geodes, if you pause the screen, are small pink eggs, the exact same parasite eggs that will infest the Smith house 1 episode later. The parasites did not come from nowhere. They were on those rocks. Rick brought them home. He just did not know it yet. Fact 62. Tao. In the Season 1 episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, as Rick is fleeing from a group of Ricks who are pursuing him, he opens several portals in rapid succession as a distraction and escape maneuver. One of those portals appears and disappears quickly enough that it is easy to miss. But in its brief opening, it spits out 3 items: a notebook, a pen, and a yellow coffee mug with a question mark on it. These are the exact items that the character Grunkle Stan loses through a portal in the Gravity Falls episode, Society of the Blind Eye. This crossover was not accidental. Justin Roiland and Gravity Falls creator Alex Hirsch are close friends, and the two of them planned a series of subtle crossover references between their shows as a gift to fans attentive enough to notice. Fact 63. In the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation, Rick encounters his ex-girlfriend Unity, a hive mind entity who has assimilated an entire planet's population. At one point, Rick instructs Unity to create a television show for him, and the show she produces, for Rick's amusement, is an alien parody of Community, Dan Harmon's previous show. The alien characters are seated around a table in the exact same configuration as the Community study group, and Rick provides what sounds like showrunner notes, requesting specific character interactions. It is a moment of pure, cheerful self-reference from a creator who has always been comfortable acknowledging that his shows are, among other things, about themselves. Fact 64. In the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, when Summer is searching the garage for clues about Rick's secret lab, she rearranges dead flies on the floor in a pattern. Later in the same episode, Rick walks through the garage and subtly, without drawing attention to it, realigns those dead flies. The realignment is the key. The specific arrangement of the dead flies is the mechanism that causes the garage floor to split and reveal the hidden lab beneath. The sequence rewards viewers who are watching carefully enough to notice that Summer's earlier fumbling had actually gotten the arrangement almost right, and that Rick's correction is both a correction of her work and an acknowledgement that she was closer to the answer than either of them said aloud. Fact 65. The episode Total Recall established a logic for identifying reality from illusion that became central to the show's subsequent treatment of memory and perception. The parasites in that episode can only implant positive memories. They are incapable of creating a memory of a bad experience with a false character, only good ones. This is how the family eventually learns to identify the false figures. They try to remember a negative memory involving each suspected parasite, and the ones they cannot remember badly are the ones who are fake. The tragedy of the episode is that this same logic nearly gets Mr. Poopy Butthole killed, because his real, genuine relationship with the Smith family has been exclusively positive. He appears indistinguishable from a parasite. His unbroken warmth becomes the thing that puts him in mortal danger. Good people, the episode suggests, sometimes look exactly like imposters. Fact 66. The signal music associated with Evil Morty, the haunting melancholy piece that plays when he is revealed or when his storyline reaches a significant moment, is For the Damaged Coda by the band Blonde Redhead. Before Rick and Morty, this was a relatively obscure piece of music. After the show used it in Season 1, its popularity surged dramatically. It has become, for a generation of viewers, inseparable from the character it scores, which is itself a testament to how completely Rick and Morty's sensibility extends into its musical choices. Fact 67. In Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, a Season 2 episode, there is a moment where Rick draws a self-portrait. The portrait, which Rick executes quickly and without ceremony, looks noticeably like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. The whole show began as a parody of Back to the Future, and Rick's visual connection to Doc Brown was always implicit, but this moment makes it explicit in the most offhand possible way. Rick draws himself and produces Doc Brown. The character cannot fully escape his own origin, no matter how far he travels from it. Fact 68. The continuity of physical damage to the Smith house across episodes is one of the most detailed and sustained examples of visual continuity in the show. Beyond the cracked garage floor mentioned earlier, attentive viewers have cataloged various other traces of past events that persist in subsequent episodes. Marks on walls, altered furniture arrangements, and the structural details that quietly accumulate to suggest that the house is living a history parallel to the one the characters are visibly living. Most television shows reset their environments between episodes. Rick and Morty does not always do this, and the exceptions are meaningful. Fact 69. In the Vat of Acid episode in Season 4, widely regarded as one of the show's best, a brief background shot of a bar shows what appears to be a version of Moe's Tavern from The Simpsons. This visual cameo arrives in an episode where Rick explicitly argues that another show has already done the plot device he and Morty are arguing about, and the Moe's Tavern appearance adds a layer to that self-awareness. The show is not just acknowledging its influences verbally, it is hiding them in the frames of the episode itself. Fact 70. The reveal that Rick's dimension of origin is C-137, rather than the dimension where the show mostly takes place, which the Rick and Morty of the main story moved to after Cronenberging their home universe in Rick Potion No. 9, is one of the show's most consequential and carefully managed pieces of lore. Rick identifies himself consistently as Rick Sanchez of Earth Dimension C-137, but the C-137 designation does not apply to any other member of the Smith family. The family around him is not his original family. The Morty who travels with him is not the Morty he was born to. This fact, laid out quietly in the background of the show's early episodes, becomes increasingly significant as the series develops. Fact 71. In the Season 1 episode, Something Wicked This Way Comes, the devil opens a shop in town selling cursed items. Rick characteristically responds not with fear or respect, but with competitive contempt. He sets up a direct competitor next door and begins scientifically debunking the curses on the items. Among the books visible on the shelves of Rick's competing enterprise are real scientific texts, placed deliberately by the production team to ground Rick's scientific credibility in recognizable material. This kind of background grounding, actual books, actual equations, actual equipment in Rick's lab, is part of how the show maintains scientific plausibility, even when the actual science is entirely invented. Fact 72. The show has a recurring minor visual joke involving Jerry Smith's professional life. Jerry works in advertising throughout much of the series, and his professional work is uniformly terrible in specific ways. Not bad in a way that makes him sympathetic, but bad in a way that reveals the particular flavor of his self-deception. His advertising campaigns are pitched with enormous sincerity and received with blank incomprehension. The joke is consistent enough across episodes that it has its own internal logic. Jerry genuinely does not know what is wrong with his work, which is the truest and saddest version of creative failure the show depicts. Fact 73. In the Season 2 episode Interdimensional Cable 2 Tempting Fate, one of the show's two celebrated interdimensional cable episodes, in which characters watch bizarre programming from across the multiverse, there are several fabricated TV shows within the episode that reference real scientific concepts. The episode's strategy of filling broadcast time with increasingly strange and specific fake programming was improvised to a significant degree, with the writers and voice actors generating content live in the recording sessions. This means that some of the specific scientific references within the fake shows arrived by accident rather than design, which is itself consistent with the way the universe of the show works, where meaning emerges from chaos rather than being imposed upon it. Fact 74. Mr. Poopy Butthole's post-credits appearances across seasons 3, 4, and 5 constitute a quietly devastating ongoing narrative. We see him in a hospital, recovering from the gunshot Beth gave him. We see him in physical therapy. We see time passing in his life. He goes through difficult periods, finds new companions, and eventually builds something resembling peace. Each appearance reveals a little more of the life he is living outside the main show, and the accumulation of those glimpses creates a complete emotional arc for a character who appears in the main narrative only rarely. It is one of the most unusual experiments in episodic storytelling that the show has attempted, and it works precisely because of how much the audience comes to care about someone they see only in fragments. Fact 75. Jerry Smith's garage contains, in one background shot, a framed photograph of Doofus Rick, the only Rick in the multiverse who was kind to Jerry, who treated him with genuine warmth and friendship during the brief period in which they spent time together. The photograph exists as a private memorial to an unexpected friendship, one that the rest of the family and the rest of the Ricks in the multiverse regarded with derision. That Jerry kept the photograph, that he hung it in the garage, tells you something about the depth of what that friendship meant to him. Even Jerry, the show seems to be saying, remembers the people who treated him like he mattered. Part 6. Real science in a cartoon universe. Rick and Morty is not a science show, but it is a show that takes science seriously enough to build its most memorable episodes around real scientific concepts, and the care with which it engages those concepts has made it something unusual in television. A popular entertainment that has made actual scientific ideas more familiar to a wide audience. Fact 76. The Season 2 premiere, A Wrinkle in Time, is built around Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the quantum mechanical principle that states, you cannot simultaneously know the precise position and the precise speed of any particle, because the act of measuring one property changes the other. The episode literalizes this principle by having Rick, Morty, and Summers attempt to exist in unresolved temporal space, having removed themselves from the normal flow of time, split into multiple simultaneous versions of themselves that multiply whenever any of them become uncertain or inconsistent in their behavior. Every argument, every moment of doubt, generates a new branch of temporal possibility. The episode ends with Rick solving the problem by achieving a moment of complete certainty, collapsing the branches back into a single timeline. It is as accurate a dramatization of uncertainty as you are likely to find in adult animation. Fact 77. Schrödinger's cat? The famous thought experiment in which a cat placed in a sealed box with something that might or might not kill it exists in a superposition of both alive and dead until the box is opened, is referenced directly in that same Season 2 premiere. When Rick attempts to explain what has happened to time, he opens a garage door to demonstrate, and the house is revealed to be floating in space surrounded by countless cats in place of stars. The visual gag is a precise and funny Schrödinger reference, and it works without requiring any explanation because the image communicates the idea instantaneously. Fact 78. The show's treatment of the multiverse draws directly from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was first proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957. The many worlds interpretation holds that all possible outcomes of any quantum event actually occur, each in a separate branch of reality. That every time a subatomic particle could go left or right, a separate universe is created in which it went the other way. The Rick and Morty multiverse takes this idea and scales it to everything, applying the branching principle not just to quantum events, but to every choice and every accident, producing an infinite set of universes in which every possible version of every possible reality exists simultaneously. Fact 79. The episode Rick Potion Number 9 involves Rick attempting to create a love potion for Morty that goes catastrophically wrong. The specific way it goes wrong is scientifically grounded in an interesting way. Rick attempts to modify the effects of the potion by using animal DNA, combining traits from multiple species to alter the love potion's behavior in the human population. When he explains what he is adding, koala mixed with chimpanzee, rattlesnake, cactus, shark, golden retriever, and just a smidge of dinosaur, he is acknowledging, with deliberate absurdity, that DNA is far more complicated than a simple additive recipe. The humor comes from the gap between the clarity of Rick's delivery and the utter impossibility of what he is describing, which is itself a precise satirical take on overconfident genetic engineering. Fact 80. In Pickle Rick's Mida, the episode that became one of the show's most culturally discussed, Rick transforms himself into a pickle. The transformation itself is not scientifically plausible, but one element of the episode is genuinely grounded in real science. Pickle Rick, having been forced to construct a mobile form for himself from cockroach parts, controls the insect's body by manipulating its brain directly using the only available tool, his tongue. The idea of controlling insects through brain stimulation is a real research area. Scientists have demonstrated that stimulating specific regions of an insect's central complex, a structure in the insect brain that governs locomotion, can produce predictable leg movements. Commercial kits exist that allow non-scientists to create remote-controlled insects through surgical intervention. Rick's approach is more extreme than anything currently available, but it is based on a real and operational scientific principle. Fact 81. The concept of hive minds, which appears in the show through the character of Unity, an alien collective intelligence who has assimilated the population of entire planets, has genuine scientific grounding in the behavior of social insects. Queen bees control their colonies through pheromone communication, which coordinates the behavior of thousands of individuals into a unified collective response. Unity's mechanism is more complex and technology-dependent, but the core idea of a distributed consciousness coordinated through a single signal source maps onto real biological models. The show does not attempt to make Unity's specific technology plausible, but the underlying concept of collective behavior unified by a single control source is very much real. Fact 82. 82. Rick and Morty's treatment of dark matter as an energy source is not scientifically accurate, but it engages with a real and significant area of cosmological research. Dark matter is a real proposed substance, a form of matter that does not interact with the electromagnetic force and therefore cannot be seen directly, but whose gravitational effects on visible matter are well documented. It accounts for approximately 27% of the total mass and energy of the universe, according to current cosmological models. Rick's ability to harness it as a power source is pure fiction, but the underlying concept of a vast invisible mass making up the majority of what the universe is made of is one of the genuinely strange and verified things science has discovered about the cosmos. Fact 83. The episode Morty Night Run includes an extended sequence in which Morty plays a virtual reality life simulation game called Roy: A Life Well Lived, in which the player inhabits the entire life of a man named Roy from birth to death, making choices that determine the quality and character of his existence. This premise is connected to the serious scientific and philosophical discussion of simulation theory. The hypothesis, taken seriously by a number of scientists and philosophers, including the late Nick Bostrom, that the reality we inhabit might itself be a sophisticated simulation running on some form of computational substrate. Elon Musk, in a widely discussed 2016 interview, stated that he believed there was a 1 in a billion chance that our reality is not a simulation. Rick and Morty engaged this idea years before it became mainstream cultural conversation. Fact 84. Cloning, which Rick uses in several episodes, most significantly to create a clone of Beth, to create a younger version of himself for various purposes, and to replace a minor character in order to prevent an execution, is based on real biological science. Scientists have been cloning mammals successfully since the late 1990s, when Dolly the sheep was created at the Roslin Institute in Scotland. Rick's cloning technology is far more sophisticated than anything currently achievable. His clones have complete cognitive function and adult development from the moment of creation. But the underlying principle of creating genetically identical copies of living organisms is not science fiction. It is science fact. Fact 85. Fjanbars. The miniaturization technology that allows Rick to shrink himself and others, and which appears most prominently in the Season 1 episode Anatomy Park, where Rick shrinks Morty and injects him inside a homeless man's body to explore the theme park built within it, is a concept with actual scientific development behind it. Nanotechnology research has produced increasingly sophisticated microscopic machines that can be introduced into living biological systems. Animal studies have demonstrated successful injection and operation of nanoscale devices within living subjects. The prospect of using such technology for targeted medical delivery, getting a drug or a repair agent to a specific location within the body, is an active area of research. Rick's Anatomy Park is a theme park version of a medical application that is, in less dramatic form, actively being developed. Fact 86. The freeze ray that Rick deploys in various episodes has a real-world scientific basis in cryogenic technology. The principle of using extreme cold to halt biological processes is already applied in medicine. Cryogenic preservation is used to store biological samples, and experimental cryopreservation techniques for human bodies have been developed, though the reanimation process remains an unsolved problem. Rick's freeze ray applies the arrest of molecular motion as a weapon rather than a preservation technique, which is an extrapolation rather than a fabrication. The difference between a freeze ray and a cryogenic medical device is the speed and precision of application, not the underlying physics. Fact 87. The show's scientific consultant during its earlier seasons was involved in ensuring that the show's use of quantum physics and cosmological concepts had enough grounding to be defensible. At a San Diego Comic-Con panel, Harmon and Roiland participated in a discussion with quantum physicist Spiros Michalakis and neuroscientist Crystal Dilworth, during which it emerged that the writing team is genuinely fascinated by science and engages with actual scientific literature in the development of episodes. Michalakis and Dilworth noted that the show's engagement with quantum concepts was serious enough to warrant real discussion, and that the writers had done homework that went beyond superficial engagement. Fact 88. The episode A Wrinkle in Time, when it depicts time literally fracturing into multiple branches based on the uncertainty of the character's intentions, represents one of the most dramatically accurate visual metaphors for quantum superposition that entertainment has ever produced. Superposition, the quantum mechanical state in which a particle simultaneously exists in multiple states until it is observed or measured, is one of the genuinely counterintuitive things that quantum mechanics proposes about reality at the smallest scales. By translating that into characters who literally split into multiple versions of themselves when they become uncertain, the show did something that most science textbooks fail to do. It made superposition legible and viscerally felt. Fact 89. The parasitic mind control concept in Total Recall has a real-world analog in the behavior of the Toxoplasma gondii parasite, which infects rats and produces behavioral changes that make them less fearful of cats, thereby increasing the chance that they will be caught and eaten, which allows the parasite to complete its reproductive cycle in the cat's gut. The idea of a parasite that rewires its host's behavior to serve the parasite's survival needs is not just a horror concept, it is a documented biological phenomenon. Rick and Morty's memory-implanting parasites are a dramatic extrapolation of a real evolutionary strategy. Fact 90. Dan Harmon said in an interview that an entire episode was scrapped during production because the science in it turned out to be wrong once it was properly checked. The episode, which was never publicly described in detail, had been developed to a significant degree of completion before someone on the production team or a consultant identified the scientific error at its core. Rather than proceeding with inaccurate science, the team chose to scrap the episode entirely. This is an unusual creative choice for a show that takes clear liberties with science in many other episodes, but it speaks to the difference between the show's willingness to extrapolate from real science and its reluctance to contradict it. Before we leave the territory of science entirely, it is worth pausing on a few more ways that the show engages with the physical world in ways that are more careful than they need to be, given how little most audiences would notice if the show simply made things up. Fact 90A. The concept of entropy, the thermodynamic principle that closed systems tend toward disorder over time, that energy dissipates, that complexity eventually collapses into simplicity, appears in the show's background philosophy in ways that are not always named, but are structurally present. Rick's universe is one of increasing entropy. Everything falls apart, everything complicated dissolves into something simpler. Every civilization eventually ends. Rick knows this. His nihilism is, in part, the emotional response of someone who has internalized thermodynamics deeply enough to apply it to meaning and purpose. The universe is winding down. Given enough time, nothing persists. If you understand this well enough, you have to decide what to do with the knowledge. Fact 90B. The show's treatment of consciousness, particularly the question of whether multiple copies of a consciousness can all be considered equally real, is one of its most philosophically serious recurring concerns. When Rick creates clones, when multiple versions of the same character exist simultaneously, when a character chooses to erase memories rather than carry them, the show is asking questions that real philosophers and cognitive scientists ask about the nature of personal identity. Is the Beth who remembers the childhood that the other Beth also remembers still the same Beth? Is the Morty who has forgotten a terrible adventure still the Morty who experienced it? The show does not answer these questions, but it keeps asking them with genuine seriousness, which is more than most entertainment bothers to do. Fact 90C. Rick's portal gun, which opens stable wormhole-like passages between dimensions, has an oblique relationship to theoretical physics. Wormholes, or Einstein-Rosen bridges, are mathematically possible within the framework of general relativity, and physicists have spent decades discussing whether they could theoretically exist and, if so, whether they could be made traversable. The consensus is that maintaining a stable, traversable wormhole would require matter with negative energy density, something called exotic matter, which has not been observed in quantities remotely sufficient for the purpose. Rick's portal fluid seems to function as a kind of exotic matter analog. The show does not explain the mechanism, which is the right choice. Specificity here would either be wrong or would require a lecture that would destroy the episode's pace. Part 7. The Reference Library. Pop culture, episode titles, and the show's influences. One of the pleasures of spending time with Rick and Morty is discovering how dense its reference grid actually is. How many films, books, songs, and shows are embedded in its DNA, sometimes on the surface and sometimes in places that require considerable digging to find. Fact 91. The show's episode titles are almost uniformly puns or modifications of existing titles from film, television, and literature, with a Rick or Morty substitution or wordplay added. Some of these are obvious. Anatomy Park for Jurassic Park, Rick Shank Redemption for The Shawshank Redemption, Total Recall for Total Recall, A Wrinkle in Time for A Wrinkle in Time. But the density of these references is remarkable. Across the show's history, at least 22 episode titles have referenced specific films or directors, and the habit has only deepened across seasons. Fact 92. The second episode of the first season, Lawnmower Dog, takes its title from the 1992 horror film The Lawnmower Man, which was loosely based on a Stephen King short story. The episode's plot, in which Morty's dog Snuffles gains enhanced intelligence through one of Rick's devices and eventually leads a canine uprising against humanity, mirrors the film's basic arc, in which a simple-minded man gains enhanced intelligence through experimentation and turns his new capabilities against those who mistreated him. The reference is not just a title gag. The structural parallel to the source material is genuine. Fact 93. The episode title Morty Night Run from Season 2 references Robert De Niro's 1988 film Midnight Run, in which a bounty hunter and his fugitive quarry are pursued by multiple factions while trying to make their way across country. The parallel to the episode, Morty on the run with a fugitive alien named Fart, pursued by various parties, is consistent enough to constitute a real structural homage rather than just a name pun. Fact 94. Pickle Rick, that the Season 3 episode that generated more cultural commentary than almost any other single episode of the show, is, according to Dan Harmon, primarily a parody of Die Hard, one of his favorite films. The episode follows a transformed Rick working his way through a hostile environment, eliminating threats with improvised weapons, in a structure that closely mirrors the trajectory of John McClane through the Nakatomi Tower. Less obviously, the episode also contains structural echoes of John Wick. Pickle Rick's use of pencils as weapons mirrors Wick's use of the same, and Rick's Russian nickname Solenya parallels Wick's Baba Yaga designation as a figure of dangerous reputation. 2 action film references layered into one episode about a pickle. Fact 95. Dan Harmon's influences in building the show's tone and concept included a range of British science fiction and literary works that are not always cited in discussions of the show. He has mentioned The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Doctor Who as significant formative influences on the show's approach to science fiction, particularly The Hitchhiker's Guide's combination of cosmic indifference with warm, slightly bewildered, human emotional responses to impossible situations. He has also cited the cult British science fiction film Zardoz, a famously strange 1974 film starring Sean Connery in a diaper that explores questions of immortality, purpose, and the relationship between the intellectual elite and the masses. Zardoz is not a film that appears in many shows' list of formative influences. Fact 96. The show has made references to South Park's production method in a quietly self-aware way. In one episode, when Rick and Morty encounter a plot that references Minecraft, Morty asks, "What about Minecraft?" And Rick responds that South Park already did it 4 years ago. Morty replies, "Wow, they're fast," and Rick says, "Yeah, or we're slow." South Park is famously produced on an extremely tight schedule, with episodes sometimes being written, animated, and broadcast in a single week. Rick and Morty, by contrast, completes entire seasons before any episodes air. The joke is also an act of transparency about the show's own pace, delivered with the kind of cheerful self-deprecation that Harmon has always practiced. Fact 97. The Season 4 episode Never Ricking Morty, which features the story train and extensively mocks fans who expect long-running dramatic plotlines to be resolved, is described as a direct response to a specific kind of fan interaction that the creative team found exhausting. By 2020, Rick and Morty had developed a vocal fan community that frequently demanded resolution on storylines involving Tammy, Evil Morty, and other ongoing narrative threads. The episode is essentially a polite but firm communication that the show will develop those stories on its own schedule and in its own way, and that demanding resolution is, in the show's view, a misunderstanding of what makes television interesting. Fact 98. The show's treatment of the purge, most prominently in the Season 2 episode Look Who's Purging Now, is a direct engagement with the premise of the film franchise, transplanted to an alien world and stripped of its political context. The episode uses the premise to explore Rick's capacity for genuine pleasure in violence, a character revelation that the comedic rapper both enables and somewhat conceals. Rick is very good at the purge. He is better at it than Morty, better at it than almost anyone in the episode. What the episode does quietly, beneath the action and comedy, is suggest that Rick's violence is not just instrumental, but appetitive. Fact 99. The show's relationship to the Fast and the Furious franchise is one of its most sustained and strange ongoing comedic references. Multiple episodes have made jokes that reference or parody the franchise's escalating absurdity. This is partially a reflection of the writer's genuine affection for the franchise's cheerful lack of concern for physics or plausibility, and partially an ongoing joke about the way action franchises develop their own mythology over time. The Fast and the Furious eventually became a franchise about family and international espionage and space travel, which, in a certain light, is not entirely unlike what Rick and Morty is. Fact 100. For the damaged coda, the blonde redhead track associated with Evil Morty, was chosen not because of any specific connection between the band and the show, but because the music director found that the track's particular emotional register, melancholy, elegant, with a quality of resigned determination, matched the character perfectly. After its use in Season 1, the song gained enough new listeners that Blonde Redhead publicly acknowledged the connection between the track's renewed popularity and the show. It is one of the cleaner examples of Rick and Morty's musical choices functioning as genuine character scoring, rather than just background placement. Fact 101. Christopher Lloyd, the actor who played Doc Brown in the Back to the Future trilogy, and therefore the most direct real-world ancestor of Rick Sanchez, was cast in a live-action Rick and Morty short that was produced and released in 2021. The choice was acknowledged as a full-circle moment. The character who was born as a crude parody of Lloyd's Doc Brown was now being played, in live action, by Lloyd himself. It is the kind of recursive joke that only a show as self-aware as Rick and Morty could pull off with complete conviction. Fact 102. Rick and Morty appeared as presenters at the 71st Primetime Emmy Awards, in an animated segment where they emerged through a portal in tuxedos to present the award for Outstanding Reality Competition Program. Rick characteristically used the occasion to deliver a meditation on the Emmy statuette itself, describing the figure as an organism whose feet and hands are permanently attached to a wooden sphere, who is forced to hold its pose while being dipped into molten gold. It is exactly the kind of thing Rick would notice and refuse not to say. They returned for the 72nd Emmy Awards in 2020, this time wearing masks in acknowledgement of the COVID-19 pandemic, with Rick expressing displeasure at having to wipe down groceries. Fact 103. The show famously appeared in a couch gag at the beginning of Mathlete's Feet, the final episode of the 26th season of The Simpsons. In the sequence, Rick accidentally crash lands his spaceship into the Simpson living room, killing the entire family. Morty is then tasked with retrieving replacements for each of them from across the multiverse. It is one of the more consequential Simpsons couch gags in terms of narrative ambition, and the crossover between the two shows that Harmon explicitly identified as the DNA of Rick and Morty is one of those things that feels both inevitable and slightly overwhelming. Fact 104. Rick and Morty also made an appearance in the 2021 Warner Brothers film Space Jam: A New Legacy, in a brief cameo where Rick and Morty are seen having experimented on the Tasmanian Devil. They declare the results disgusting and voluntarily return Taz to LeBron James and the Looney Tunes by dropping him on the windshield of their rocket. The cameo is consistent with the show's approach to these appearances. Even in someone else's franchise, Rick is dismissive, critical, and largely indifferent to the people around him. Fact 105. The first issue of the official Rick and Morty comic book series, published by Oni Press, was such a significant commercial success that it sold out everywhere and became difficult to find at a reasonable price. The demand exceeded all expectations, and Oni Press subsequently expanded into multiple spin-off titles, including Pickle Rick-focused issues and Vindicator stories. The comic series maintained the show's voice well enough to be widely recommended by fans of the television series, though comics and television are different enough media that the best issues tend to be the ones that took advantage of the visual format in ways the show itself could not. Part 8. When fiction moved the real world, cultural impact, and the Szechuan sauce phenomenon. Rick and Morty is unusual among animated shows in having had real, measurable effects on the world outside its own broadcast. These effects range from minor but charming to genuinely unprecedented in the history of fast food marketing. Fact 106. The Szechuan sauce story begins in 1998 when McDonald's introduced a promotional dipping sauce for their chicken nuggets to coincide with the release of Disney's animated film Mulan. The sauce was teriyaki-based, sweet, mildly tangy, with hints of soy and ginger, and it was available for approximately 1 month during the film's theatrical run. When the promotion ended, the sauce was pulled from menus and largely forgotten. For almost 20 years, it was nothing more than a memory for people who happened to have tried it in 1998. Fact 107. On April 1st, 2017, April Fool's Day, Adult Swim surprised the entire Rick and Morty fanbase by airing the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, without any prior announcement. The episode itself was already remarkable for its emotional density and plot developments, but its final moments produced something that no one in the show's production could have predicted. In a long, passionate, half-deranged speech about the nature of his character's motivation, Rick declared that his only real goal in life, his series arc, was to find more of the McDonald's Mulan promotional Szechuan teriyaki dipping sauce that he had tasted as a memory once, and never recovered from. Fact 108, the speech was specific enough, naming the sauce, naming the film, naming the year, that it immediately became a rallying point for the show's fan community. A grassroots campaign to pressure McDonald's into bringing the sauce back erupted within days of the episode's broadcast. Petitions circulated. Social media posts accumulated in the tens of thousands. McDonald's, which had almost certainly forgotten that the sauce existed, found itself the object of an organized popular demand driven entirely by an animated television show. Fact 109. McDonald's acknowledged the demand by sending Justin Roiland himself a 4-pound jug of Szechuan sauce. The accompanying note explained that they had located it in Dimension C-1998, a dimension where it's always 1998. 1998 every day. No smartphones, no social media. The letter's deliberate adoption of the show's voice and cosmology was a remarkably good piece of brand communication, demonstrating that McDonald's understood exactly what audience it was talking to. Fact 110. McDonald's announced in October 2017 that the sauce would return for a single day, October 7th, 2017, at select locations across the country. They significantly underestimated what was going to happen next. Fans arrived at McDonald's locations by the hundreds. Lines stretched out of parking lots and down streets. Individual locations ran out of their entire supply within minutes. People who had traveled significant distances to join lines that moved too slowly became furious. There were reported confrontations, police called to some locations to manage crowds, and incidents of fans screaming at employees who had simply run out of sauce and had nothing more to give. The entire event became national news for approximately 48 hours. Fact 111. In February 2018, McDonald's announced a broader return of the sauce, this time with an estimated 20 million portions distributed across all locations in the United States. This was a response to the chaos of October 2017. A correction, and a very large one. The sauce was made available in standard packaging alongside special, limited edition 5-packet sets with gold foil designs that, when arranged correctly, spelled out the word Szechuan. The second release was met with high demand, but considerably less chaos than the first, in part because the supply was genuinely sufficient to meet the interest this time. Fact 112. The entire Szechuan sauce incident is widely cited in marketing and cultural studies discussions as one of the most dramatic examples of fan-driven viral marketing in the social media era. What makes it truly remarkable is that it was entirely accidental on the show's part. No one on the Rick and Morty production team was coordinating with McDonald's. The speech was a joke, a specific, committed, brilliantly delivered joke about the arbitrary things human beings attach emotional significance to, and the audience responded by treating the object of the joke as a genuine cultural artifact worth fighting for. The fictional desire of an animated character became the real desire of millions of real people. Fact 113. Rick and Morty won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2018 and again in 2020. These two wins placed it among the most recognized animated shows of the streaming era. The show's Emmy history also includes being nominated for a third time in 2019. For a show that began on a late-night cable network with a small initial audience, this kind of recognition from the television industry's most mainstream awards body is significant evidence of how much the cultural conversation around adult animation had shifted during Rick and Morty's run. Fact 114. According to Adult Swim, Rick and Morty has been viewed over 10 billion times globally across linear television, digital, and streaming platforms, accumulated across the show's lifetime to that point. To put that number in context, 10 billion views is more than the population of the Earth. The show has been watched collectively for a sum of human attention that exceeds any single population's capacity. It is the kind of number that begins to lose meaning, which is itself very Rick and Morty. Fact 115. Rick and Morty became, according to Nielsen data, the most watched television comedy among adults between the ages of 18 and 24 during its third season. Season 3 also ended with the best ratings in Adult Swim's broadcast history at the time, an 81% increase in total viewers over the second season. This growth was not just impressive, it was historically unusual. Most shows see ratings plateau or decline as they enter their third season. Rick and Morty nearly doubled. Fact 116. The show was the top comedy across all U.S. cable television in 2017, 2019, and 2021. 3 separate years with different seasons active and different cultural contexts surrounding each one. The consistency of its dominance across those years speaks to a viewer loyalty that is unusual for any show, but particularly unusual for an animated series on a late-night cable network. Fact 117. In 2018, Adult Swim announced a deal that renewed Rick and Morty for 70 new episodes, one of the largest single orders in adult animation history. The announcement itself became a cultural moment, and the way it was framed, 70 episodes over an unspecified number of seasons, was deliberately nonspecific in a way that felt consistent with the show's own sensibility. 70 episodes could mean 7 seasons of 10, or 5 seasons of 14, or any other configuration. The ambiguity was, in its way, part of the deal's personality. Fact 118. By 2024, the show's renewal had been extended through a 12th season, announced at New York Comic Con. This means Rick and Morty has guaranteed network commitment through at least 4 more seasons beyond what was originally imagined when the 70-episode deal was struck. For a show that began as a 6-hour writing session in an unfurnished office, this level of institutional commitment is staggering. Fact 119. The Rick and Morty fan community, which has been one of the most enthusiastic and occasionally most troublesome in recent television history, has also produced some of its most creative work in relation to the show. Fan-created animations, reimaginings, and theoretical analyses have accumulated into a body of work that rivals many official productions in its ambition and depth. The State of Georgia versus Denver Fenton Allen fan animation is one example. When Justin Roiland performed the actual transcript of a profane courtroom exchange live at San Diego Comic-Con in 2016, a fan created a full animated version of the performance in just 2 months, setting the audio against original animation. The result is, by most accounts, genuinely funny and has been broadly shared. Fact 120. On the occasion of the announcement that Rick and Morty had been renewed for 70 new episodes, the show's social media response was itself a meta-commentary on the renewal. The tweet that announced the deal was structured as a numbered list of responses to the news, mirroring the format of fan-made lists about the show. It was signed as being from Rick, and it contained the specific brand of dismissive, fourth-wall-aware humor that characterizes the character. Even in its promotional materials, Rick and Morty refuses to fully exit the fictional frame. There are a few more dimensions to the show's cultural impact worth exploring, because its effects on the culture around it were not limited to a single sauce incident or a single ratings record. Fact 120A. The show produced a real and measurable effect on interest in science and philosophy among its audience. Surveys of science and philosophy students at various universities found spikes in enrollment in courses on quantum mechanics, cosmology, and ethics that correlated with periods of high Rick and Morty viewership. This is admittedly difficult to attribute cleanly, but it is consistent with the show's practice of naming real concepts. Heisenberg, Schrödinger, simulation theory, the multiverse interpretation, and then dramatizing them in ways that made audiences curious enough to look them up. Entertainment that makes people curious is a rarer thing than it should be. Fact 120b. The show's merchandise reached $100 million franchise scale, with products ranging from the expected, clothing, collectible figures, posters, to the genuinely unexpected, including scientific equipment kits themed around Rick's lab, philosophical question cards based on the show's themes, and collaborations with fine dining restaurants to create themed tasting menus. The range of the merchandise reflects the range of the audience. People who wanted a Pickle Rick t-shirt, people who wanted a genuine intellectual engagement with the show's ideas, and people who wanted both at the same time. Fact 120c. The game Pocket Mortys, a mobile game released by Adult Swim in which players collect and battle various alternate versions of Morty Smith in a structure that deliberately parodies the Pokemon franchise, was downloaded millions of times and maintained an active player base for years after its initial release. Justin Roiland provided additional voice work specifically for the game, and its development was treated seriously as an extension of the show's universe, rather than a simple promotional tie-in. The game contained enough callbacks to show lore and enough genuinely funny dialogue that fans who had never played a mobile game in their lives downloaded it simply to spend more time in the show's world. Part 9. The characters themselves. Deep facts and small revelations. Beyond the plots and the production details, the characters of Rick and Morty are some of the most carefully constructed and emotionally layered figures in contemporary animation. The facts about them are not just trivia, they are doors into understanding why the show works as well as it does. Fact 121. Rick Sanchez's home dimension is specifically identified as C-137. But the universe where most of the main action takes place is not C-137. It is a universe that Rick and Morty moved to after the events of Rick Potion number 9, when they destroyed their original dimension by turning the entire human population into what the show calls Cronenberg monsters. They buried their original bodies in the backyard of their new home, assumed their dead counterparts' lives, and resumed as if nothing had happened. Rick is living with a version of his family that is not the one he started with. This fact haunts the emotional texture of every scene between Rick and Beth, every moment between Rick and Morty. There is a permanent distance built into the relationship by the knowledge that they are not quite each other's originals. Fact 122. Morty Smith is 14 years old throughout most of the series. His age is significant because it anchors the show's domestic scenes in the specific emotional territory of early adolescence, the period when a person's sense of identity is most unstable, when the relationship between who you are and who you are becoming is most open to influence. Rick's presence in Morty's life during this period is not incidental. The show has been quietly building a portrait of the specific, lasting damage that a charismatic, brilliant, and deeply troubled authority figure can do to a developing personality. Fact 123. Jerry Smith's name has a quiet and slightly sad backstory. It was also the name of Justin Roiland's dog. The dog passed away during the period the show was in production, and the naming of the character as Jerry was a kind of memorial, a way of carrying something private into the public work. Given how the show treats Jerry Smith, this biographical detail is either poignant or deeply ironic, depending on your perspective on how dogs deserve to be commemorated. Fact 124. The character of King Jellybean, who appears in the Season 1 episode Me Seeks and Destroy as a figure who attempts to assault Morty, was developed from a character that Justin Roiland had originally created for a different animated show called Unbelievable Tales. In that show, the character went by the name Crumply Crumplestein. The show was never produced, but the character survived the transition into Rick and Morty as King Jellybean. In the episode, the character appears benevolent and wise until a brief, disturbing scene reveals his true nature. It is one of the most tonal, abrupt moments in the entire first season, and it lands harder because of how completely the show has built trust in the character before destroying it. Fact 125. Birdperson was designed from the beginning to serve a specific narrative function. He is Rick's mirror. not a reflective mirror. Bird person does not show Rick who he is, but a projective one. He shows Rick who he could have been. They fought in the same war. They survived the same chaos. They made the same choices about what to risk for what they believed in. But where Rick emerged from those experiences broken and defensive and nihilistic, Bird person emerged with his principles intact. He is the road not taken, expressed as a tall birdman with an extremely calm voice. Fact 126. The reveal of Evil Morty's eye patch as a communications device that he used to control the Rick who had been kidnapping Morty's, delivered at the end of the season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, was planned as the show's first genuine long-game narrative surprise. Evil Morty's return and eventual election to the presidency of the Citadel of Ricks was planned years in advance. The show's creators have confirmed that Evil Morty's arc was a deliberate exercise in patience, building a character across seasons in such a way that each appearance added information without resolving anything, accumulating toward a payoff that grew more significant with every episode that passed without it. Fact 127. The central finite curve. The barrier that Evil Morty eventually breaks through, the wall separating the dimensions where Rick is the smartest person in the universe from the dimensions where he is not, was introduced and explained in the same season 5 episode where it is dismantled. This is an unusual narrative choice. To hold the concept until the moment of its destruction, to define a thing only in the act of destroying it. The result is an explanation that hits with the same force as a reveal, because understanding what the curve is and understanding what its dissolution means happen at exactly the same moment. Fact 128. Squanchy's language, his habit of substituting the word squanch for almost any noun, verb, or adjective in ways that can mean almost anything depending on context, was not planned as a running language joke when the character was first created. It developed organically from Roiland's improvisation during recording and became one of the show's most imitated bits of dialogue. The flexibility of squanch as a linguistic unit, its ability to be positive, negative, imperative, or descriptive depending entirely on context and delivery, is genuinely funny in the way that invented words with too much utility often are. Fact 129. Mr. Poopy Butthole's name, which has made him perhaps the most unexpectedly named emotionally significant character in animation history, was chosen as a deliberate joke about the gap between form and function. The producers wanted a character whose name would make audiences dismiss him before he had the chance to matter, and then wanted to matter anyway, despite the name. The joke is that the character who comes closest to embodying unconditional warmth and genuine moral clarity is named Mr. Poopy Butthole. It is the show's way of saying that superficial signals, including names, including first impressions, should not govern how seriously you take someone. Fact 130. Space Beth. The Beth who has been living outside the domestic confines of the Smith household, traveling with Rick across dimensions while the Earth Beth stays home with Jerry and the kids, is one of the show's most ambitious ongoing experiments in character development. The question of which Beth is the original, and whether either Beth can or should claim priority over the other, is not just a plot puzzle. It is a question about identity. Is the self defined by where it came from, or by what it chooses? Is the Beth who stayed home more real than the Beth who left, simply because one made a conventional choice and the other made an adventurous one? The show has been turning this question over for multiple seasons without resolving it, and the turning is the point. Fact 131. Summer Smith's arc across the series represents one of the most consistent and thoughtful examples of character growth in the show. She begins as a conventionally teenage figure concerned primarily with social status and the opinions of her peers. She ends, by the later seasons, as someone who has handled alien encounters, interdimensional threats, and moral crises with more composure than several adult characters. The growth is not presented as a simple improvement, but as a complicated transformation. Summer becoming more capable by becoming, in some ways, harder. The show is genuinely attentive to what growing up in Rick's world does to a person. Fact 132. The therapist doctor. Wong, who appears in the Pickle Rick episode to deliver the most incisive and uncomfortable analysis of Rick's psychology in the entire series, is voiced by Susan Sarandon. Her return as Dr. Wong in Season 7, where she reappears in a different context, continues one of the show's most quietly important ongoing relationships. Dr. Wong is one of the few characters in the entire show who speaks to Rick without being intimidated by him, without being impressed by him, and without needing anything from him. She simply sees him clearly and says what she sees. Rick cannot outrun this, no matter how many times he tries. Fact 133. Doofus Rick. The alternate version of Rick from a different dimension who is the only Rick in the entire multiverse who genuinely enjoys Jerry's company, and who is mocked by all other Ricks for this quality among others, functions as a kind of gentle counter-argument to the idea that all Ricks are fundamentally the same. Doofus Rick likes Jerry. He is kind to him. He treats him with warmth and without mockery. This does not make him weak or pathetic or lesser, but the other Ricks respond to him as though it does, which reveals something about them rather than something about him. In a world of Ricks who have all chosen contempt as their default mode, Doofus Rick chose differently, and the show treats his difference with quiet respect. Fact 134. Rick's blue hair, which is the visual signature as distinctive as his lab coat and his flask, was originally developed as part of a design choice to make him look visually unusual in a way that suggested he was not entirely of the world he was living in. Blue hair is not a common human hair color, which means it reads, subtly, as wrong in the domestic suburban setting of the Smith house. It marks him, from the first frame he appears in, as someone who does not quite fit the environment he is occupying. It was a small design decision with a large visual effect. Fact 135. Beth Smith's backstory, that she got pregnant with Summer in high school and married Jerry partly because her father was absent and she needed security, is never delivered as a clean expository monologue. It emerges across multiple seasons in fragments, through implication, through the behavior patterns of both Beth and Jerry, through what they say when they are least guarded. The show trusts its audience to assemble the backstory from the pieces, which means that understanding why Beth and Jerry's marriage works the way it does requires genuine attention sustained across years of viewing. Fact 136. The character of Unity, Rick's ex-girlfriend who is a collective hive mind entity, represents the show's most direct exploration of Rick's capacity for genuine emotional connection. Their relationship, which is depicted in the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation and its aftermath, shows Rick experiencing something like real happiness before it collapses under the weight of what he is. Unity's departure and the scene in Rick's lab that follows it, in which Rick appears to be attempting to take his own life, interrupted only by the accidental triggering of one of his own devices, is one of the show's most devastating tonal shifts. It arrives after 40 minutes of anarchic comedy and lands like a stone dropped in still water. Fact 137. The episode Morty's Mind Blowers, in which Rick and Morty discover a cache of memories that Rick has erased from Morty's mind, contains, in the sheer quantity of the erased memories visible in the storage drawer, a quiet statement about the accumulation of trauma. There are hundreds of vials. The number is not incidental. It represents years of adventures, hundreds of terrible things that Morty experienced and chose not to carry consciously forward. The episode acknowledges, without dwelling on it, that something like post-traumatic response is happening to Morty in real time across the show, and that the adventures we watch are only a fraction of the adventures that occurred. Fact 138. The Rick and Morty of the main timeline are consistently identified as unique in the multiverse in a specific and counterintuitive way. They have survived more, adapted more, and developed their relationship to greater depth than almost any other Rick and Morty pairing across all dimensions. This is implied rather than stated directly, but it appears in comments from other Ricks and in the behavior of institutions like the Citadel. Our Rick and our Morty are, by some metric the show declines to define precisely, exceptional, which means that the show we are watching is not an average story about a Rick and a Morty. It is the story of a Rick and a Morty who are somehow different. This fact makes both characters more interesting and more fragile simultaneously. There are more character-level facts worth sitting with before we move on to the show's more recent history, because the small details are often where the most significant meanings hide. Fact 138A: Rick's relationship with Summer Smith, his older granddaughter, evolved in ways that were not planned from the outset of the show but emerged organically from how the character developed across seasons. In the early episodes, Summer was primarily a foil, present in the house but excluded from the main adventures by Rick's explicit preference for Morty. As the show developed, and the writers gained confidence with her voice, Summer gradually forced her way into the narrative, partly by sheer will and partly because the writers discovered that she was more interesting than the early episodes had suggested. The arcs in which Summer accompanies Rick on missions and handles herself with unexpected competence are among the more emotionally surprising developments in the show's history, because they play against the established expectation of who Rick chooses. Fact 138B: Jerry Smith's relationship with alien cultures is one of the show's most consistent and quietly philosophical running jokes. Jerry, who is the least capable member of the Smith household by every conventional metric, somehow manages to survive encounters with alien civilizations, intergalactic threats, and interdimensional dangers that would destroy more competent people. The show has offered various explanations for this over the years. Luck, the protection of narrative convenience, the specific uselessness that makes him unthreatening to potential attackers. But none of them fully accounts for Jerry's survival. His ability to persist against all reasonable probability might be the most genuinely impressive thing about him. Fact 138C: The marriage between Beth and Jerry is, when examined closely, one of the most psychologically accurate depictions of a dysfunctional but genuinely loving relationship in popular animation. The show does not present their marriage as simply bad, as something that should end and would end if either of them were smarter or braver. It presents it as a genuine entanglement, something that has produced real moments of warmth and real children and real shared history alongside the dysfunction. Beth and Jerry need things from each other that they cannot clearly articulate and would probably not acknowledge if asked. The show respects the complexity of that entanglement enough not to resolve it simply, which is its own form of honesty about how marriages actually work. Part 10. Where the show is now. Seasons 7, 8, 9, and beyond. The story of Rick and Morty after Justin Roiland's departure from the show is one of the more remarkable continuity stories in television history. A show that survived the exit of the person who voiced its two lead characters, maintained its identity, continued to develop its ongoing narratives, and has been renewed through at least a 12th season. Fact 139. Season 7 of Rick and Morty premiered on October 15, 2023, and was the first season produced entirely without Justin Roiland's involvement in any creative capacity beyond his existing co-creator credit. The new voices of Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden were kept secret throughout production and promotion. The trailers for Season 7 featured the new voices without crediting the actors, and were revealed only in the credits of the premiere episode itself. The decision to hold the names until the episode aired was itself a kind of storytelling choice. Let the voices speak for themselves before any information about their source could shape the audience's reception. Fact 140. Critical response to Season 7's voice performances was remarkably consistent. Almost all reviewers noted that the new actors were virtually indistinguishable from Roiland's originals in the vast majority of scenes. Rolling Stone's Alan Sepinwall, reviewing the first two episodes, wrote that the characters sounded essentially identical to their previous appearances. This was a significant enough achievement that it became the dominant narrative of Season 7's reception, not whether the show had survived the transition, but how thoroughly it had managed it. Fact 141. Season 8 of Rick and Morty premiered on May 25, 2025, and concluded on July 27, 2025. The 10-episode season continued the show's post-Roiland development, with Cardoni and Belden fully settled into their respective roles, and the production team exploring narrative territory that felt liberated from some of the creative tensions that had characterized the later Roiland era. Season 8 was, by critical consensus, a stronger season than 7. the show finding its footing in its new form, rather than simply demonstrating that it could survive the transition. Fact 142. In 2024, Rick and Morty, the anime, premiered on August 16th, directed by Takashi Sano. This was the full series adaptation of anime short films that had been released previously, and it represented the show's most significant formal experiment to date. An entirely different animation style, a different cultural context, and a different production team interpreting the same characters and universe that the main show had established. The anime series was received as a genuinely interesting extension of the property, rather than a simple repackaging of existing material. Fact 143. At San Diego Comic-Con in July 2025, a spin-off series focused on President Curtis, the recurring character voiced by Keith David, who has been one of Rick's most entertaining antagonists across multiple seasons, was announced. President Curtis has been one of the show's more beloved secondary characters, and his relationship with Rick, a battle of egos between two people who are each convinced of their own superiority in different domains, has generated some of the show's funniest and most dramatically interesting confrontations. A spin-off built around him represents a genuine vote of confidence in a character whose appeal has grown substantially across his appearances. Fact 144. The show has been renewed through a 12th season, meaning that as of 2026, Rick and Morty has guaranteed institutional support for at least 4 more full seasons beyond the 8th. Given the show's history of approximately 1 season per year to 18 months, this represents a production commitment extending through approximately 2030 or beyond. For a show that was greenlit based on a 6-hour writing session, this level of institutional commitment is the kind of thing that would have been genuinely unimaginable to Harmon and Roiland when they sat down in that unfurnished office in 2012. Fact 145. The announcement of Season 9 was accompanied by a promotional message that included the phrase, "No AI slop, just grade A organic slop," a deliberate acknowledgement of the industry-wide conversation about artificial intelligence in creative work, and a statement of the show's position within that conversation. The show has always had a self-aware relationship with its own creative process, and this framing of its production values as deliberately, defiantly human-generated is consistent with that sensibility. It is also funny, which helps. Fact 146. The relationship between Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland had been strained for years before the 2023 firing. According to various accounts, the two had not spoken to each other directly since 2019, communicating only by text in the months before even that channel closed. Roiland had reportedly stopped attending production meetings during Season 3 and had been contributing to the show only through remotely recorded voice lines, arriving at his home studio alone to record dialogue without visiting the production offices where the actual creative work was happening. The show had, in a real sense, been functioning without Roiland's active creative participation for years before his formal departure. Fact 147. Mike McMahon, who began his career at Rick and Morty as a writer's assistant before receiving a writing credit on the first season, went on to co-create Solar Opposites with Justin Roiland and Hulu, and subsequently created Star Trek Lower Decks. His career trajectory, from assistant in an uncredited role to showrunner of a major franchise series, is one of the more striking examples of what working in that specific writer's room, in that specific environment, produced for the people who came through it. Fact 148. The ongoing question of what happened in Rick's past, specifically the nature of the original loss that shaped his character, the death or absence that turned him from whatever he was before into the person we see in the show, has been answered in pieces across Seasons 4, 5, and 6. The arc involving Prime Rick, the version of Rick who murdered the younger Rick's wife and daughter in an alternative timeline, recontextualized the show's emotional backstory in ways that made Rick's nihilism feel earned rather than posed. The revelation that Rick C-137 is a man who built himself into the most dangerous person in the universe specifically to find and destroy the person who took everything from him gives the character a tragic coherence that he did not entirely have before. Fact 149. The show's Season 5 episode Rick Mirai Jack, which concludes what is arguably the most ambitious narrative arc the show has undertaken, revealed that the Evil Morty storyline and the Prime Rick storyline were both, at some level, about the same thing. The question of what you do when the systems meant to protect you are actually designed to control you. Evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve and Rick's resolution of his conflict with Prime Rick happened in different emotional registers. One cold and strategic, one raw and deeply personal, but both arrived at the same philosophical destination: freedom from the structure that had been shaping your life without your consent. Fact 150. The show's use of serialization has evolved significantly across its run. The early seasons were largely episodic, with the serialized elements, the ongoing emotional backstory, the question of Evil Morty, the implications of how many dimensions Rick has visited, functioning as background enrichment for standalone stories. From around Season 3 onward, the serialized elements became more foregrounded, more deliberately developed, more clearly designed to accumulate towards specific payoffs. The show did not abandon its episodic instincts. Standalone adventures remain central to what Rick and Morty is, but it learned how to interweave ongoing narrative with those standalone structures in ways that felt earned rather than forced. Fact 151. Dan Harmon has spoken in interviews about the way Rick and Morty's success changed his own relationship to the work. He has described the period after the show became a genuine cultural phenomenon, after the third season, after the 70-episode deal, after the Szechuan sauce incident, as one of increased pressure and intensified self-scrutiny. The show had become something that people were invested in far beyond what he had imagined, and the weight of that investment had to be managed alongside the ordinary difficulties of producing complex television. His response, characteristically, was to lean harder into craft, to use the story circle more rigorously, to push the writing room toward more emotional precision, to ask harder questions about what each episode was ultimately about. Fact 152. The legacy of Rick and Morty within adult animation is already significant enough to be discussed in historical terms, even while the show is ongoing. It demonstrated that an animated show for adults could be simultaneously popular enough to break cable viewership records and sophisticated enough to generate substantive critical engagement. It showed that science fiction concepts and genuine philosophical questions could coexist with bathroom humor and pratfall comedy in ways that enhanced rather than undermined each other. And it proved, perhaps most importantly, that audiences would invest deeply in animated characters if those characters were given interior lives complex enough to be worth caring about. Fact 153. Of all the things Rick and Morty has accomplished across its run, the thing that might be most significant is the simplest. It made a lot of people feel less alone. That sounds like a large claim for a show with a talking pickle and a man who burps through his sentences. But the show's treatment of loneliness, of the difficulty of connection, of the way that intelligence and capability can become barriers to love as often as they become pathways to it, these themes are not incidental decorations on a science fiction comedy. They are the show's primary substance. Rick Sanchez is, underneath everything, a person who loves deeply and cannot easily show it, surrounded by people who love him back and do not always understand him. That equation is common enough to recognize in almost every life. The portal gun and the alien planets are the frame. The love, hidden and difficult and imperfect, is the picture. And that equation, the gap between what people feel and what they manage to express, is why the show has sustained its audience so well across so many years and so many changes in the culture around it. Television comes and goes. Trends arrive and dissolve. But stories about people trying to reach each other across the distances that intelligence and fear and pride create between them are stories that never become irrelevant. Rick and Morty tells that story through a lens of infinite dimensions and casual apocalypses and creatures that should not be real, and it tells it without flinching, and that is the thing that makes it last. The show's longevity, guaranteed now through at least a 12th season, having already outlasted the involvement of one of its two creators, having survived cultural storms that would have ended lesser productions, is itself a kind of argument about what audiences want. They want to be surprised. They want to laugh until something becomes unexpectedly serious, and then they want the serious thing to have been earned by all the laughing that came before it. They want characters who are genuinely complicated, who do not resolve into simple moral positions, who remain capable of surprising you even after you have spent years watching them. Rick and Morty offers all of this, consistently, in a format so strange and specific that it could not have been predicted by any formula. It began with a crude animated short, a chance meeting at a film festival, and a first draft written in 6 hours in an unfurnished office. It grew into something that sent real people into real chaos over a fast food dipping sauce. It made science interesting to people who had never cared about quantum mechanics. It made nihilism feel warm, and then made warmth feel defiant. It kept, quietly and consistently, telling the truth about how hard it is to love someone who is difficult, and how worth it that difficulty is anyway. 153 facts. One long story about a show that somehow became, against all reasonable odds, exactly what the moment needed. And that is all 153. Every origin, every hidden detail, every scientific truth, and creative accident that went into making something as strange and as genuinely moving as Rick and Morty. We went all the way from that crude animated short at a Los Angeles film festival to a show renewed through a 12th season. From a 6-hour writing session in an unfurnished office to 10 billion global views. From the moment Roiland accidentally burped during a recording and decided to run with it, to the moment a made-up scientist's love of a forgotten dipping sauce sent people rioting outside McDonald's locations across America. There is no other show quite like it. There may never be. If this video helped you relax, made the space behind your eyes feel a little quieter, or gave you something comfortable to rest inside for a while, then that is exactly what it was meant to do. If you want more of these, more slow dives into the worlds of shows and films and characters you love, then subscribing to the channel is the simplest way to make sure you never miss one. I put a lot of care into every one of them, and knowing you are here for them matters more than I usually remember to say. Sleep well. You know where we will be when you need us again.